नंदन ब्रज जनरंजन यमुना तीरावनचारि यमुना तीरावनचारि जय राधमाधव कुंज बिहारी जय राधमाधव बिहारी
ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरये। नास्तिप्रेषु भद्रेषु नित्यं भगवत सेवया भगवती उत्तमा श्लोके भक्ति भवति नैष्टिकी। So we'll be reading from third canto, chapter 4, called The Creation of the Universal Form, starting from text 11. Yes, we'll read from 7 to 34 or 36, 34. We're on 3. Oh, sorry. 6. Sorry, bro. Okay. Thank you. Please.
Maitreya said, "You may now hear from me how the Supreme Lord separated himself into the diverse forms of the demigods after the manifestation of the gigantic universal form.
Agni or heat separated from his mouth, and all the directors of material affairs entered into it in their respective positions. By that energy, the living entity expresses himself in words.
When the palette of the gigantic form was separately manifested, Varuna, the director of water and the planetary systems, entered therein, and thus the living entity has the facility to taste everything with his tongue.
When the Lord's 2 nostrils separately manifested themselves, the dual Ashvini Kumaras entered them in their proper positions, and the living entities can smell the
the two of the Lord were separate and manifested. The sun, the director of light, entered them with the partial representation of eyesight, and thus the living entities can have vision of forms.
When there was a manifestation of skin separated from the gigantic form, Anila, the deity directing the wind, entered with partial touch, and thus the living entities can realize tactile knowledge.
When the ears of the gigantic form became manifested, all the controlling deities of the directions entered them with the hearing principles by which all living entities hear and take advantage of sound.
Was a separate manifestation of skin, controlling deities of sensations and their different parts entered into it, and thus the living entities feel itching and happiness due to touch.
When the genitals of the gigantic form separately became manifest, their Prapu Japati, the original living creature, entered them with his partial semen, and thus the living entities can enjoy sex pleasure.
The evacuating channel separately became manifest, and the director, named Mitra, entered into it with partial organs of evacuation. Thus, the living entities are able to pass stool and urine.
Thereafter, when the hands of the gigantic form separately became manifested, Indra, the ruler of the heavenly planets, entered into them, and thus the living entity is able to transact business for his livelihood. Thereafter, the legs of the gigantic form separately became manifest, and the demigod named Vishnu, not the personality Godhead, entered with partial movement. This helps the living entity move to his destination.
When the intelligence of the gigantic form separately became manifest, Brahma, the Lord of the Vedas, entered into it with the partial power of understanding, and thus an object of understanding is experienced by the living entities.
After that, the heart of the gigantic form separately manifested itself and entered into the moon demigod with partial mental activity. Thus, the living entity can conduct his mental speculations.
Thereafter, the materialistic ego of the gigantic form separately manifested itself, and into it entered Aruda, the controller of the false ego, with his own partial activities, by which the living entity transacts his objective action.
Thereafter, when his consciousness separately manifested itself, the total energy, Mahatattva, entered in with his conscious part. Thus, the living entity is able to conceive specific knowledge.
Thereafter, from the head of the gigantic form, the heavenly planets were manifested, and from his legs, the earthly planets, and from his abdomen, the sky separately manifested themselves. Within them, the demigods and others were manifested in terms of the modes of material nature.
The demigods, qualified by the super excellent quality of the mode of goodness, are situated in the heavenly planets, whereas the human beings, because of their nature and the mode of fashion, live on the earth in company with their subordinates.
Living entities who are associates of Rudra develop in the third mode of material nature, or ignorance. They are situated in the sky between the earthly planets and the heavenly planets.
Chief of the Kuru dynasty, Vedic wisdom became manifest from the mouth of the Virat, the gigantic form. Those who are inclined to this Vedic knowledge are called Brahmins, and they are the natural teachers and spiritual masters of all the orders of society.
Thereafter, the power of protection was generated from the arms of the gigantic Virat form of the relation to such power of the Kikashetras also came into existence by following the Kikashetra principle by protecting society from the servants of thieves and miscreants.
The means of livelihood of all persons, namely production of grains and their distribution to the prajas, was generated from the thighs of the Lord's gigantic form. The mercantile men who take charge of such execution are called Vaishyas.
Thereafter, service was manifested from the legs of the personality of Godhead for sake of perfecting the religious function. Situated on the legs are the sutras who satisfy the Lord by service.
All these different social divisions are born with their occupational duties and living conditions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, for unconditional life and self-realization, one has to worship the Supreme Lord under the direction of the spiritual master.
So we'll read the verse 34 and the purport of 34. So let's start by chanting the Sanskrit all in response. Ete varna swadharmena yajanti swagurum hari Shraddhayatma vishuddhiyartham yajata saha pritibhi ete varna swadharmena yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhiyartham yajata saha vrittibhi. Anyone else like to chant? Ete varna swadharmena yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhartham yajata saha vrittibhi ete varna swadharmena yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhiyartham yajata saha vrittibhi ete varna swadharmena yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhartham yajata saha vrittibhi ete varna swadharmena yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhiyartham yajata saha vrittibhi ete varna swadharmena yajanti swagurum harim Shraddhayatma yajata saha vrittibhi. Let's read the word-to-word translation together, please. Ite, all these, varna, orders of society, swadharmena, by one's own occupational duties, yajanti, worship, swagurum, with the spiritual master, harim, the supreme personality of Godhead, shraddhaya, with the faith and devotion, atma, self, vishuddhi, artham, for purifying, yat, from whom, jataha, born, saha, along with, Prithivi, occupational duty. Translation. All these different social divisions are born with their occupational duties and living conditions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, for unconditional life and self-realization, one has to worship the Supreme Lord under the direction of the spiritual master. purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Since they are born from different part of the body of the Supreme Lord in His gigantic form, all living entities in all parts of the entire universe are supposed to be eternal servitors of the Supreme Body. Every part of our own body, such as the mouth, hands, thighs, and legs, is meant to render service to the whole. That is their constitutional position. In subhuman life, the living entities are not conscious of this constitutional position. But in the human form of life, they are supposed to know this through the systems of the Varnas, through the system of the Varnas, the social orders. As above mentioned, the Brahmin is the spiritual master of all the orders of society, and thus Brahminical culture, culminating in the transcendental service of the Lord, is the basic principle for purifying the soul. Anyone else like to?
In conditioned life, the soul is under the impression that he can become the Lord of the universe. And the last point of this misconception is to think oneself the supreme. The foolish, conditioned soul does not take into account that the supreme cannot be conditioned by Maya or illusion. If the supreme were to become conditioned by illusion, where would be his supremacy? In that case, Maya or illusion would be the supreme. Therefore, a condition, they cannot be supreme. The actual position of the conditioned soul is explained in this verse. All the conditioned souls are impure due to contact with the material energy and three modes of nature. Therefore, it is necessary that they purify themselves under the guidance of the bona fide spiritual master, who not only is Brahmana by qualification, but must also be a Vaishnava. The only self-purifying process mentioned herein is to worship the Lord under the recognized method, under the guidance of the bona fide spiritual master. That is the natural way of purification, and no other method is recommended as bona fide. The other methods of purification may be helpful to come to this stage of life, but ultimately one has to come to this last point before he attains actual perfection. Bhagavad Gita 7:19 confirms this truth as follows.
Vasudeva Sarvamiti Samatma Sudurlabha. Let's read the translation together. All these different social divisions are born with their occupational duties and living conditions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, for unconditional life and self-realization, one has to worship the Supreme Lord under the direction of the spiritual master. So, while I was reading these verses, I thought about I'll start with asking you all. I'm just kind of curious. I want to take this poll of like how many of you find like these verses related to the the universal form, the gigantic form, the Virat Rupa, as really fascinating. Like that, this is the thing that you like to hear more about or learn or enjoy about hearing Krishna's the universal form.
It's like my thing, but it's nice.
Yeah. How many of you find it like inconceivable and maybe even a little bit overwhelming? For some reason I thought like there'll be more people in the first category and less in the second, because I don't know, for some reason like Amrita Kelly, she's really fascinated by it, so I thought there'll be more like her and less like me. But I guess it's the other way around. Well, either way, so that's the point. Like for me, it's really kind of inconceivable and actually puts me in a humble position of, just like how hard it is to comprehend just the universal form. Like, what about to think about like the whole creation and all the other things. So, but the problem is that it gives these different ways that different people may get attracted to build that relationship with Krishna. That's the essence of Bhagavatam, right? And before we start reading Bhagavatam, we hear that story, right? Like Narad Muni, or sorry, Vyasadeva, he has written all these scriptures. He's not feeling satisfied, right? And it's just mind-boggling that, like, from all the achievements that he has done, all the various scriptures he has already written, why would that be the case, right? And then at that time, spiritual master Narad Muni instructs him by saying that, hey, you have actually not glorified the personal form of the Lord and his pastimes, and that's why you're feeling this way. So that's at that time he's instructed to write Bhagavatam, right? And so that's why it's and